There is something your soulmate recently realized about you that they were never supposed to understand this clearly. While they were going through one of those moments they didn't tell anyone about, while they were quietly carrying something that was becoming heavier every day, you were watching from a distance. You weren't interfering. You weren't demanding answers. You weren't sending messages just to remind them that you still cared. You simply noticed. And now that they have somehow connected the pieces, they cannot stop thinking about it. Because they thought your silence meant you had moved on. They thought your distance meant you stopped caring. They thought you had finally turned your heart away. But now they are beginning to wonder if the truth was completely different. What if you knew they were struggling and chose not to expose their weakness? What if you saw the cracks they were desperately trying to hide and decided that loving them meant giving them space instead of forcing your way back into their life? Imagine standing outside a storm while someone you love is trapped inside, knowing you could knock on the door, knowing they might need you, but also knowing that sometimes another person has to find their own way through the darkness. That may be what your silence looked like to them. And this realization is hitting differently because they are remembering the little things now. The moments you suddenly became quiet. The times you seemed to know something was wrong without being told. The strange timing of your presence, followed by your distance. They are replaying those moments and asking themselves one painful question. How long were they watching me struggle without ever letting me know? And the answer may be much deeper than they are ready to accept, because you weren't watching out of curiosity. You were watching because a part of you still cared, even when you had every reason to walk away. As the pieces come together, they are beginning to understand that your silence may have been saying something your words never could. I see you, even when you think nobody does, and now they can't stop wondering what else you saw that they thought they had hidden so well. Now that they know you were aware of what they were going through, something strange has started happening inside their mind. They keep going backward, not physically but emotionally. They are revisiting old conversations, old messages, those brief moments when your eyes seemed to say something your mouth never did. They are looking at memories they once considered ordinary, and suddenly realizing there may have been another story underneath all of them. That is what happens when a truth arrives late. It doesn't simply change the present. It travels backward and changes the meaning of the past. And your soulmate is experiencing exactly that. They are remembering the days when they were struggling but pretending everything was fine, and now they are wondering how you knew. How did you notice the change in their voice? How did you sense something was wrong when they never admitted it? Why did you suddenly become quieter around them instead of asking 100 questions? Why did you seem to understand when they couldn't even explain themselves? These questions are beginning to follow them into the quiet moments, especially when there is nothing around them to distract their mind. Imagine opening an old message you once ignored and suddenly realizing that the words inside it were written by someone who already knew you were hurting. The message hasn't changed. You have. Your soulmate is looking at those moments differently now, and that is what makes them emotionally difficult to escape. They may remember a simple "Are you okay?" that they brushed aside. They may remember you checking in without asking for details. They may remember how you disappeared after realizing they didn't want to talk. At the time, they may have thought you were being distant. Now they are wondering if you were giving them room to breathe. And that realization can hurt more than anger ever could. Because suddenly your silence doesn't look empty anymore. It looks intentional. It looks careful. It looks like someone was standing close enough to notice everything, but far enough away not to make their pain about themselves. Sometimes the deepest kind of care is the kind that never demands to be acknowledged. That idea is beginning to settle inside them, and they don't know what to do with it. Because if you really cared that much, why didn't you come closer? Why didn't you tell them what you knew? Why didn't you fight harder for a place beside them? These are the questions they may be asking themselves now, but the answer is complicated. You may have understood something they didn't understand about themselves at the time. Sometimes a person who is struggling doesn't need another person forcing open a door they have deliberately closed. Sometimes love means standing outside that door and letting them know, without saying it, that you're still there. Imagine watching a lighthouse from far across the ocean. You cannot control the waves. You cannot calm the storm with your hands. You cannot force the ship to change direction. All you can do is remain a light in the distance, visible whenever they are ready to look for it. That may be how your soulmate is beginning to understand your presence. You weren't necessarily trying to rescue them. You were simply refusing to stop caring. And now they are remembering something else that makes this even harder. There were probably moments when you could have used their vulnerability to get closer to them. You could have asked questions. You could have made them feel guilty for pushing you away. You could have said, "I knew you were struggling and you still ignored me," but you didn't. You kept your distance. You allowed them to maintain their dignity even when you knew there was more happening beneath the surface. That restraint is what they may be struggling to understand now, because most people expect love to announce itself. They expect messages, confessions, dramatic gestures, constant checking in. Your love may have looked completely different. It may have looked like restraint. It may have looked like waiting. It may have looked like knowing when not to speak. And now they are beginning to wonder whether the person they thought had stopped caring was actually the person who understood their pain better than anyone else. You were closer to my pain than I ever realized, and I was too lost inside it to notice you standing there. That is the kind of thought that can keep someone awake. They may start replaying the exact moments when your energy changed around them. The conversations where you seemed unusually careful. The days when you looked at them as if you wanted to say something but decided against it. The moments when you gave them space instead of demanding an explanation. Suddenly all of those memories connect. And when they connect, something inside them shifts. They realize you weren't absent during their difficult season. You were present in a way they couldn't recognize at the time. You were watching quietly, learning what they needed, and perhaps protecting yourself from becoming another source of pressure in their life. That realization creates a strange mixture of comfort and regret. Comfort because they weren't as alone as they believed. Regret because they now understand that someone cared without asking for anything in return. And this is where their thoughts become difficult to control. They begin asking themselves whether you were waiting for them to reach out, whether you wanted them to notice, whether you ever cried privately because you couldn't help them the way you wanted to, whether you eventually stopped watching because caring from a distance became too painful. That last question is the one that scares them most. Because if you were quietly there when they were struggling, what happens if you are no longer there now? What if the distance that once protected them has finally become the distance separating you permanently? They don't have an answer yet. All they have are memories, fragments, pauses, and moments that suddenly carry a completely different meaning. And the more they revisit them, the harder it becomes to believe that your silence was ever indifference. They are beginning to understand that you may have been fighting your own emotions while quietly hoping they would find their way through theirs. And now one realization is becoming impossible for them to escape. Maybe the person they thought walked away was actually the person who stayed the longest without ever asking to be seen. And now they are beginning to understand the part they got wrong about you. Your distance was never as simple as they made it. They looked at the space between you and assumed it meant your feelings had disappeared. They saw your silence and called it coldness. They noticed you weren't chasing them anymore and convinced themselves that you had finally stopped caring. But now, after everything they have been remembering, that explanation doesn't fit anymore. Something about it feels incomplete. Because if you truly didn't care, why were you still noticing when they were struggling? Why did you seem to know when something was wrong without asking for an explanation? Why did you give them space when you could have used their vulnerable moments as an opportunity to get closer? Those questions are beginning to change the entire story in their mind. They are realizing that sometimes distance isn't created because love disappeared. Sometimes distance is created because love became strong enough to understand boundaries. Imagine standing outside someone's house during a violent storm. You know they're inside. You know they are hurting. Every instinct tells you to knock on the door, walk inside, and make sure they're okay. But then you realize they locked the door because they needed somewhere quiet to fall apart. So you stay outside. You don't leave because you don't care. You stay because you care enough not to force your way in. That is the kind of love your soulmate may finally be recognizing in you. You didn't need their weakness to prove that you mattered. You didn't need to become their savior. You didn't need them to thank you for noticing. You simply watched, cared, and allowed them to move through something they had to face themselves. And that realization can be painful because it forces them to question the way they treated your silence. Maybe they thought you were punishing them. Maybe they thought you were playing games. Maybe they believed you were waiting for them to make the first move because your ego wouldn't allow you to reach out. But what if none of that was true? What if you were protecting both of you from making an emotional decision in the middle of a storm? Real love doesn't always move closer. Sometimes it knows when to step back without turning its heart away. That sentence is beginning to describe what they are seeing now. Your silence wasn't necessarily a wall. It may have been a form of protection. You were protecting their space, protecting your own heart, and perhaps protecting the connection from becoming another source of pressure while they were already struggling to hold themselves together. And the more they think about it, the more uncomfortable the realization becomes. Because they may have spent so much time wondering why you weren't fighting for them that they never stopped to ask what you were fighting against inside yourself. Maybe you wanted to reach out. Maybe there were nights when you almost did. Maybe you typed something, stared at it, and then deleted it because you knew the timing wasn't right. Maybe you had 1,000 things you wanted to say, but chose one quiet sentence instead. I'm here if you need me. And then you actually gave them the freedom to decide whether they needed you. That is a very different kind of love. It doesn't chase. It doesn't manipulate. It doesn't turn someone's pain into leverage. It simply remains available without demanding access. Imagine holding a door open for someone who is too overwhelmed to notice you are there. You don't drag them through it. You don't shout at them to hurry. You simply hold it for as long as you can and allow them to choose whether they want to walk through. That may be what your soulmate is realizing about you now. You were never trying to control their journey. You were trying to respect it. And that understanding may be making them look at you differently, because there is a huge difference between someone who disappears when things become difficult and someone who stays quietly present without making the difficult moment about themselves. They're beginning to recognize which one you were. This is where regret starts entering the picture. Not necessarily regret over everything that happened between you, but regret over what they misunderstood. They may be wondering how many times they pushed you away while secretly hoping you would stay. How many times they interpreted your silence as indifference when you were actually giving them room. How many times they assumed you had moved on simply because you stopped explaining your feelings. And perhaps the hardest question is this: did I mistake the person who cared the most for the person who cared the least? Because once that question enters someone's mind, old memories become dangerous. A glance can become evidence. A quiet moment can become a confession. A message can suddenly sound like something completely different. Even your absence can begin to feel like a form of love because they finally understand why you stepped away. You weren't necessarily running from them. You may have been trying not to become another weight they had to carry. And that realization changes everything. They are beginning to see that you didn't need to be beside them every second to care about what happened to them. You didn't need constant communication to notice when their energy changed. You didn't need access to every detail of their life to understand that something inside them wasn't okay. You saw enough. You felt enough. And instead of making demands, you stayed quiet. Sometimes the person who says the least is carrying the most. That thought may be haunting them now because it forces them to consider what you were experiencing while they were busy dealing with their own pain. They may finally understand that watching someone struggle from a distance isn't easy when your heart is still connected to them. It means caring without control. It means wanting to reach out while knowing that reaching out might make everything harder. It means accepting that sometimes you can love someone deeply and still have to let them find their own way. And perhaps that is why your soulmate can't stop thinking about you now. They aren't simply remembering that you were there. They are realizing how deliberately you chose to be there without interfering. They are beginning to understand that your distance may have contained more tenderness than they ever recognized while you were close. And once that realization settles in, another thought begins to rise, one they may not be ready to face yet. If you cared enough to stay quietly during their darkest moment, how much did it cost you to finally walk away? But there is one part of this realization they haven't fully faced yet, and this may be the part that hurts the most. If you were really watching them struggle from a distance, if you really knew what they were going through and still chose to remain quiet, then what were you going through while you were watching? That question is beginning to change everything for them, because it is easy to imagine your silence when they only think about their own pain. It is much harder to imagine what it must have felt like for you to care about someone who didn't know you were caring. They are starting to understand that your distance may not have been effortless at all. You may have looked calm on the outside while fighting an entirely different battle inside. You may have wanted to reach for your phone, wanted to ask how they were doing, wanted to tell them that you knew they weren't okay, and then stopped yourself because something inside you said, "Not yet." Not because your feelings weren't strong enough, but because they were. Imagine standing on the other side of a river, watching someone you love struggle against the current. You can see exactly where they are. You can hear them fighting the water. Every part of you wants to jump in, but you know that if you enter at the wrong moment, both of you could be pulled under. So you stay on the shore, watching, waiting, hoping they find solid ground. That kind of restraint doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Nobody applauds it. Nobody sees the nights when it hurts. But that doesn't make it any less painful. And your soulmate may finally be realizing that. They may be thinking about all the times they assumed you were fine because you didn't complain. All the times they thought you had moved on because you weren't asking questions. All the times they believed your quietness meant you weren't emotionally affected. What they didn't see was what happened after the conversation ended. They didn't see the thoughts you carried home. They didn't see the messages you didn't send. They didn't see the moments when you wondered whether reaching out would heal something or simply reopen a wound. You never saw the battles I fought just to respect the distance between us. That is the realization beginning to settle inside them. And it changes the emotional weight of everything that happened. Because now they are forced to consider that perhaps you were not simply watching them struggle. Perhaps you were struggling too, just in a completely different way. They were trying to survive what was happening inside their world, while you were trying to survive the feeling of caring about someone you couldn't simply save. There is a unique kind of pain in watching someone you love make choices that hurt them, while knowing you cannot make those choices for them. You can advise, you can offer support, you can stay available, but ultimately they have to walk their own road. And maybe that is why you remained at a distance. You understood that rescuing them would never teach them how to rescue themselves. So you chose patience over pressure. You chose silence over another emotional conversation. You chose to let them discover their own strength, even when a part of you wanted desperately to make things easier. Imagine holding a letter that contains everything you want to say to someone, then placing it in a drawer because you know they aren't ready to read it. The words are still there. The feelings are still there. Nothing disappeared. You simply decided that forcing the moment would destroy the meaning of the message. That may be how your soulmate is beginning to understand your silence. You weren't empty. You were holding something back. And now they are wondering how much you held back. How many feelings did you swallow? How many times did you almost break your silence? How many nights did you tell yourself that caring from a distance was better than becoming another source of confusion? These questions can create a powerful kind of regret because your soulmate may now realize that while they were focused on whether you still cared, they never stopped to ask what your silence was costing you. They may remember moments when you looked like you wanted to say something but didn't. They may remember a softness in your expression that didn't match the distance in your behavior. They may remember how you seemed to know when they were having a difficult day, even when they tried to hide it. At the time, they might have dismissed those things. Now, those memories feel almost impossible to ignore. Maybe they weren't walking away from me. Maybe they were walking away from the version of us that was hurting both of us. That thought can change a person's entire understanding of separation. Because sometimes leaving isn't the opposite of love. Sometimes leaving is what someone does when staying in the same unhealthy pattern would destroy the very thing they still care about. And your soulmate may be realizing that your absence wasn't necessarily punishment. It may have been protection. Protection for you, protection for them, protection for whatever remained genuine between you. This is why they can't simply dismiss the thought anymore. If you truly didn't care, your behavior would have been easier to understand. You would have disappeared emotionally. You would have stopped noticing. You would have stopped caring about what happened to them. But something about your behavior suggested the opposite. You were distant but aware, quiet but present. Removed but still somehow connected, and that contradiction is what keeps pulling them back into their memories. They are beginning to realize that your silence may have been the only way you knew how to love them without losing yourself in the process. And perhaps the hardest part is this: you may have never expected them to understand any of it. You weren't collecting evidence. You weren't waiting for recognition. You weren't secretly keeping score. You simply made a choice and lived with the consequences. But now they are looking backward with a different perspective, and suddenly they can see the emotional price you may have paid for that choice. They may wonder whether you cried when nobody was watching, whether you missed them while pretending you didn't, whether you ever wished they would simply turn around and notice you. And those questions are powerful because they force them to see you as a person who was hurting too, not just the calm, distant figure they created in their mind. The person they thought had everything under control may have been holding themselves together for a reason. You weren't untouched. You were restrained. You weren't emotionless. You were protecting your emotions. And now, as your soulmate finally begins to understand that, another fear starts growing beneath all the regret. What if the person who cared enough to watch them from a distance eventually became tired of watching? What if the silence they once misunderstood is now the silence of someone who has finally chosen to stop waiting? That is the thought they can't easily escape, because for the first time, they are not only thinking about what you felt for them then, they are wondering what you feel for them now. And now they are facing the realization they were trying hardest to avoid. It is no longer about whether you cared. They know you did. It is no longer about whether you noticed their struggle. They are beginning to understand that you did. The question that is haunting them now is much more personal. What if you finally stopped waiting? Because there is a difference between someone who walks away because they stopped caring and someone who walks away because they cared for too long without knowing where they stood. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that difference, and it is changing the way they see everything about you. They are thinking about your silence differently. Your distance feels different. Even your absence carries a different weight now. They may have once believed that if you truly wanted them, you would keep trying forever. They assumed your feelings would always remain somewhere in the background, waiting for the right moment. But now they are beginning to realize that even the deepest love can become tired when it has nowhere to go. Imagine a lighthouse that has been shining toward the same ocean night after night. The light never stopped working. It never stopped reaching outward. But eventually, the lighthouse keeper realizes that the ship he was watching for may never turn toward the shore. The light can remain beautiful, but that doesn't mean it can wait forever. That may be the fear your soulmate is feeling now. They are wondering whether you finally turned your attention away from the horizon, whether you finally chose yourself, whether the person who once quietly watched them struggle is now quietly building a life that no longer revolves around whether they return. And that thought can be more frightening than losing an argument, because there is nothing to fight against. There is no enemy to blame, no dramatic ending to reverse, just the possibility that someone who once cared deeply has reached a point where they no longer need an answer. The hardest person to lose is the one who never stopped caring, but finally stopped waiting. That is the truth beginning to settle inside them. They may now be asking themselves what would happen if they reached out. Would you still answer with the same warmth? Would you recognize the person they have become? Would you believe their words? Or would you simply look at them with the calm understanding of someone who has already made peace with the past? These questions are not easy because your soulmate knows something has changed. You changed. Not necessarily because your feelings disappeared, but because the experience changed you. You learned how to care without chasing. You learned how to miss someone without abandoning yourself. You learned that love doesn't require you to stand outside the same closed door forever. And that growth is exactly what they may be sensing now. They can feel that you are no longer standing in the same emotional place where they left you. Imagine returning to a house you once knew by heart and discovering that everything inside has been rearranged. The walls are still familiar. The memories are still there. But the person who lived there has grown into someone you don't completely recognize anymore. That may be how your soulmate feels when they think about you now. Familiar but different. Close but unreachable in the same old way. They remember the version of you who wanted answers, who wondered what they were feeling, who silently hoped they would notice how much you cared. But now they are beginning to sense a different version of you. Someone who can love deeply without losing their center. Someone who doesn't need to prove the connection exists. Someone who doesn't need to force a conversation simply because silence feels uncomfortable. And that is what makes them think about you even more. Because when someone stops chasing, the absence becomes noticeable. The quiet becomes louder. The memories become sharper. Suddenly, all the little things they once ignored begin appearing in their mind without invitation. The way you looked at them, the way you remembered details, the way you noticed their mood, the way you gave them space when they expected pressure, the way you cared without demanding credit. They may now realize that you were offering something they didn't know how to receive at the time. And perhaps that is why this realization has arrived so strongly. They are not simply missing you. They are finally understanding you. There is a difference. Missing someone says, "I wish you were here." Understanding someone says, "Now I know what I couldn't see before." Your soulmate may be moving from the first feeling into the second. They are beginning to understand that your distance was not necessarily rejection. Your quietness was not emptiness. Your absence was not proof that the connection meant nothing. Sometimes people step back because they are trying to protect something that still matters. Sometimes they stop speaking because they have already said everything their heart knows how to say. And sometimes the person who looks like they have moved on is simply the person who finally learned how to carry their feelings without letting those feelings control their life. You didn't stop caring. You stopped abandoning yourself just to prove that you cared. That realization can hit harder than any confession, because now your soulmate has to confront their own part in the story. They may wonder whether they pushed away the one person who understood them without requiring them to explain every wound. Whether they mistook patience for weakness. Whether they mistook distance for indifference. Whether they assumed you would always be there simply because you had always cared. And now there is no guarantee. That uncertainty is what keeps pulling their thoughts back toward you. They may be imagining what it would feel like to see you again. What they would say, what they would admit, whether they would finally tell you about the things they were hiding back then. Whether they would apologize for the moments when they made you feel unwanted while secretly needing your presence. They may never say all of this immediately. Sometimes realization arrives long before courage does, but something has already changed inside them. They can no longer look at your silence the way they used to. They know there was love inside it. They know there was restraint inside it. They know there was pain inside it. And now they are left with one final truth. You may have been watching them struggle from a distance, but they were never the only one carrying something silently. You were carrying the weight of caring without knowing whether you would ever be understood. And perhaps that is why this connection still feels unfinished to them. Not because destiny guarantees a reunion, not because everything will magically fall back into place, but because the truth has finally surfaced. They now know that someone saw them when they thought nobody did. Someone cared when they were too overwhelmed to recognize it. Someone stayed emotionally present without forcing their way into their life. And that kind of love is difficult to forget. So if they have been thinking about you more lately, if old memories seem to return at strange moments, if they suddenly wonder why you became quiet when they were struggling, understand what may be happening beneath the surface. They are not simply remembering you. They are revisiting the version of themselves that existed when you quietly cared for them. And somewhere inside that reflection, they are beginning to see your value differently. The person they thought was standing far away may have been the person closest to their heart all along. They just didn't know how to recognize it until the distance finally gave them enough silence to hear what your presence had been saying. And now the question is no longer whether they can stop thinking about you. The question is whether they will finally have the courage to do something about what they now understand.